He called me clumsy in front of the entire surgical team. The words sliced through the air sharper than any scalpel. "Step away before you ruin the incision," he barked, his tone dripping with disdain. My hands froze. The operating room lights glared down like a cruel spotlight, exposing every ounce of my shame. I felt the heat rise to my face as the nurses exchanged awkward glances, their silence louder than his insult. I swallowed the humiliation, staring at the floor, my gloves trembling. Dr. Adrian Volkov, the hospital's celebrated cardiac surgeon, smirked as if my pain amused him. That day, I promised myself I would never let him see me break. What I did not know then was that life had its own theater. One day, the same surgeon who broke my confidence would lie helpless beneath those same lights, and I would hold his life in my hands. My name is Dr. Emilia Sorin, and when I first walked into St. Verena Medical Center, I thought I had stepped into the beating heart of heaven and hell combined. The hospital towered above the city of Montreal, its white walls gleaming in the early morning sun, reflecting ambition and mercy in equal measure. The glass facade shone like a promise, and yet beneath its brilliance lived a labyrinth of stories, of triumph, failure, birth, and death. I was one of the many who entered its doors carrying dreams, unaware of how easily those dreams could bleed. St. Verena was the pride of Montreal, a European city known for its classical architecture and stormy skies. The hospital's main atrium smelled faintly of antiseptic and lilies, a strange blend of sterility and comfort. The marble floor stretched endlessly, echoing with hurried footsteps and murmured prayers. The walls carried portraits of past directors, stern men in crisp suits, women with resolute gazes, who had shaped the hospital's legacy. I often stood before those portraits, wondering if any of them had ever felt the same trembling uncertainty I felt inside. I came from a quiet village an hour away, a place where time moved slowly, and kindness was not a choice but a habit. My parents owned a small bakery on a corner street that always smelled of fresh bread and cinnamon. My mother, a gentle woman with soft hands, often worked through the dawn, her fingers dusted with flour, her laughter echoing through the small shop. My father, strong and calm, managed the deliveries, his face always glowing with pride whenever someone praised my achievements. When I received the acceptance letter to St. Verena's surgical residency program, my mother cried in silence, pressing the letter to her chest. My father hugged me with arms that smelled of yeast and said, "Emilia, skill will take you far, but compassion will take you further." Those words became the quiet rhythm of my heart in the years that followed. My early days at St. Verena were overwhelming. The hospital operated like a living organism. Every person a cell, every department a vital organ, every emergency, a pulse of adrenaline that coursed through the building. I was one among hundreds of residents, but the halls made me feel both invisible and exposed. Everyone seemed to know where they belonged, except me. There was Dr. Helene Strauss, my mentor, a senior attending surgeon whose reputation for calm precision preceded her. She was respected for her intellect and feared for her discipline. Beneath her strict demeanor, however, was a quiet kindness that reminded me of my mother. She noticed effort more than results, and that small mercy gave me courage to survive my first few weeks. The surgical department was dominated by one man, Dr. Adrian Volkov. His name carried the weight of legend. He had studied in Geneva, trained under Europe's finest cardiac experts, and published research that had earned him global recognition. He was the kind of surgeon who inspired awe the moment he entered a room. Tall, sharp-featured, and utterly composed, he possessed an air of command that silenced everyone around him. People spoke of him as if he were a deity in scrubs. I first saw him in the operating theater on my third day. The team gathered for a complex coronary bypass. I stood among other residents, watching him glide through the procedure with almost divine precision. His voice was low but firm, his movements fluid and deliberate. There was no hesitation, no wasted motion. Watching him work was like witnessing a pianist perform a flawless concerto. After that day, I understood why the hospital revered him. But admiration soon mixed with fear. Dr. Volkov demanded perfection not as an aspiration, but as an absolute. He did not believe in weakness, and he had no patience for human error. His criticisms were legendary, his temper quick, his words surgical and cruel. When I was assigned to his team during my second rotation, A nurse named Clara, the head scrub nurse, gave me a sympathetic look. Clara had worked at St. Verena for over 20 years. She was a woman of quiet strength, the kind who could calm a storm with a single word. "Be precise," she told me softly as we prepped for surgery. "He does not forgive hesitation." Her warning echoed in my mind that entire week. The first time I stood across from Dr. Volkov in surgery, I could feel my pulse in my fingertips. The room was sterile, cold, and humming with fluorescent light. Every beep of the monitor sounded like a countdown. I held the retractor exactly as instructed, my arms stiff, my focus unbroken. Sweat gathered beneath my mask. Dr. Volkov worked with an intensity that bordered on violence, not in his movements but in his energy. He demanded absolute obedience from his team, and any mistake, however minor, felt like a personal offense to him. At one point, I adjusted my position to improve my line of sight. His voice sliced through the silence. "Do not move unless instructed." I froze. His tone was not loud, but it carried the weight of judgment. The nurses exchanged quick glances, but no one spoke. I wanted to apologize, but my voice was trapped beneath my mask. I simply nodded and focused on breathing. When the operation ended and the patient was wheeled away safely, the relief in the room was palpable. Yet, Dr. Volkov left without a word. No acknowledgement, no glance, just a swift removal of gloves and departure. To him, success was expected, not celebrated. That night, I sat in the residence lounge, my body aching from standing, my heart heavy. I wanted to believe that his cruelty was a form of discipline, that perhaps he was shaping us for excellence. But as days turned into weeks, I began to see the truth. He used humiliation as a tool. It was not about making us better surgeons. It was about proving his dominance. Still, I stayed. I worked longer hours, studied harder, and refused to be broken. I arrived at the hospital before dawn, when the corridors were still empty, and reviewed surgical techniques in the quiet of the simulation lab. The smell of disinfectant had become familiar, almost comforting. I practiced sutures on artificial tissue until my fingers grew sore, repeating the motion until it felt like second nature. Sometimes the night shift nurses would find me there and offer a cup of coffee. Clara often stayed late herself. "You have something rare, Amelia," she once said gently as she watched me work. "Most people want to impress him. You want to improve. That is the difference." Her words meant more to me than she could have known. Outside the operating theater, I found brief moments of peace in the patient's ward. There was a boy named Theo, only 8 years old, recovering from a congenital heart repair. He would draw on scraps of paper with colored pencils I brought from home. He once gave me a drawing of a heart surrounded by stars. "This is your superpower," he said with a shy smile. I kept that drawing in my locker. It reminded me why I was here. As months passed, I grew more capable. I handled minor wound closures, managed patient rounds, and assisted in complex cases. Yet no matter how much progress I made, Dr. Volkov never saw me. To him, I remained invisible, a name on a rotation chart, a pair of hands to command. But there was one day, a small but significant one, when he paused. We were reviewing pre-op scans in the conference room. I noticed a minor anomaly in a patient's angiogram, something subtle that the computer algorithm had missed. I mentioned it carefully, expecting dismissal. Instead, he stopped mid-sentence and looked at the screen again. His silence stretched for several seconds before he said, "You are right." It was only 3 words, but to me, they were a mountain of validation. I thought perhaps that moment marked a shift, that he would begin to see me not as a burden, but as a colleague in the making. I was wrong. The following week, during another surgery, a nurse accidentally dropped a clamp. Dr. Volkov's fury erupted like a storm. His voice echoed against the sterile walls, and though the mistake was not mine, his glare found me. I realized then that I was his easiest target, the one person he could unleash his perfectionism upon without consequence. Each insult sank deeper, carving away my confidence. I began to measure every step, every breath, afraid of existing too loudly. Yet deep down, something inside me hardened. I promised myself that I would endure. I would not let him define my worth. I often remembered the bakery at home, my parents' tired yet proud faces, the scent of fresh bread at dawn. It reminded me that I came from a place where humility was not weakness, it was strength. And one day, I would show him that the quietest hands could still perform miracles. In the hospital, winter came with relentless storms. The windows of the wards fogged with condensation, and the sound of rain on glass became a lullaby through sleepless nights. The workload increased, the emergencies multiplied, and exhaustion became our companion. But within that fatigue, I began to feel a strange clarity. I understood now that survival in this profession was not about being perfect in his eyes. It was about enduring long enough to prove that compassion had a power perfection could never touch. I did not know it then, but life was watching quietly, preparing its cruel symmetry. The same man who called me clumsy would one day depend entirely on those same hands he had ridiculed, and when that day came, I would not tremble. The day of humiliation began like any other, yet something in the air felt different. Heavier, expectant, almost like the calm before a storm. I remember the faint scent of rain through the hospital corridors that morning, the steady rhythm of footsteps echoing against the linoleum floors, and the uneasy flutter in my chest that I tried to ignore. It was Thursday, the busiest surgical day at St. Verena Medical Center. The schedule board glowed with a list of operations stacked back to back. My name appeared beside Dr. Adrian Volkov once again, assisting him in a high-profile cardiac bypass. The patient was Eveline Rocher, the wife of a visiting diplomat, and the success of her surgery would determine not only her life, but also the hospital's reputation. I remember standing in the scrub room, the mirror before me reflecting my masked face. The sterile smell of iodine and alcohol filled the air. I tied my surgical cap tighter, forcing my trembling hands to be still. Clara entered behind me, adjusting her gloves. "You will be fine," she murmured, her eyes soft behind the clear visor. "You know the procedure better than half the team." I wanted to believe her, but a voice inside whispered doubt. When we stepped into the operating theater, the lights blazed down like interrogation lamps. The patient was prepped and draped, the monitors humming with their endless rhythm. The team was tense, every movement controlled, precise. Then he entered, Dr. Volkov, immaculate as ever. His presence changed the energy in the room instantly. It was as though the oxygen shifted to his command. His expression was calm, detached, superior. He nodded once and the operation began. Hours passed in a blur of movement and metal. The rhythmic beeping of the monitor was hypnotic. My hands moved in perfect coordination with his commands. Clamp, suture, retractor, gauze. Every gesture had to be precise, every second mattered. But perfection is fragile. Halfway through, the suction line clogged, a minor technical issue that could happen in any surgery. I moved instinctively to fix it, my focus entirely on ensuring clear visibility for the surgeon. But in that split second, as I leaned forward, my sterile sleeve brushed against the edge of the drape. It was the smallest movement, imperceptible to anyone except him. "Stop!" His voice cracked through the silence like lightning. The entire room froze. The air thickened. Even the monitor seemed to hesitate between beats. He turned toward me, eyes cold and sharp as glass. "Step away," he said, his tone low but venomous. "You are contaminating my field." My breath caught. The nurses looked away. "You are clumsy," he continued, louder this time, his words cutting through the mask that hid my trembling lips. "I told you once, surgery is not for those who cannot control their own hands." Every syllable landed like a lash across my pride. My throat burned with unshed tears, but I did not move. I could not. My feet felt nailed to the floor. "Out," he said finally. The word echoed. I turned and walked out slowly, my face burning beneath my mask. Behind me, I could hear the rustle of surgical instruments resuming, the quiet whispers that followed humiliation like vultures circling over a wound. I spent the rest of that night in the locker room, my scrubs still on, my gloves discarded beside me. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting my shadow in broken shapes against the wall. I thought of my father's words. "Skill will take you far, compassion will take you further," and wondered which part of me had failed him today. When I finally returned home to my small apartment near the hospital, dawn had already touched the sky. The world was waking, yet I felt lifeless. I sat by the window and watched the sun rise over Montreal, its light spilling through the mist like mercy I did not deserve. The next morning, whispers greeted me in every corridor. Residents avoided my gaze. Some offered sympathetic smiles. Others looked relieved that the wrath had not been theirs this time. In St. Verena, humiliation was a silent rite of passage. Everyone knew it could happen to anyone, but few survived it with dignity intact. Still, I returned to work. I refused to let shame silence me. I threw myself into my duties, determined to rebuild what his words had broken. I arrived earlier, stayed later, practiced every technique until exhaustion blurred the line between my hands and the instruments they held. In the evenings, when the wards quieted and the lights dimmed, I would retreat to the simulation lab. There, I stitched artificial tissue again and again, my fingers steady, my eyes focused. Sometimes Clara found me there and stayed beside me, wordless, offering quiet companionship. "You are too hard on yourself," she said once. "I must be," I replied, though my voice barely rose above a whisper. "If I am not, he wins." Over the following weeks, I began to notice something. My fear of him had changed. It no longer felt like paralysis. It became fuel. Every time I remembered his voice calling me clumsy, my determination grew sharper. But the hospital had a way of testing resolve. One afternoon, I was called to assist in the trauma unit. A young man had been brought in after a motorcycle accident, his chest punctured by shattered ribs. I was the first surgical resident on scene. The attending surgeon was delayed, and the patient's vitals were dropping rapidly. Instinct took over. I stabilized the airway, controlled the bleeding, and guided the nurses with a confidence that surprised even myself. When Dr. Helene Strauss arrived minutes later, she found the patient alive, his heart rhythm restored. She looked at me with quiet pride. "Good work, Dr. Soren," she said simply, before turning her attention to the monitors. That small acknowledgement mended a piece of my spirit. For the first time since the incident, I felt capable again, but not everyone was pleased. Word of my performance reached Dr. Volkoff's ears. During the next departmental meeting, he acknowledged several residents for their progress. My name was not among them. I sat at the far end of the table, silent, invisible. His avoidance was deliberate, as if my very presence offended him. It did not matter. I was no longer seeking his approval. Winter crept into Montreal like a slow exhale. The days grew shorter, the air colder. Snow dusted the hospital roof, and the nights felt endless. The emergency calls became more frequent. Heart attacks, accidents, crises that blurred into one another. I grew stronger with every challenge, but the memory of that public humiliation remained like a scar, one that throbbed quietly in moments of stillness. Then, one bitter January morning, fate turned the page. It began with a blizzard. The sky was pale gray, the streets almost silent beneath the snow. Inside St. Verena, the generators hummed, the lights flickered, and the surgical wing was stretched thin with emergencies. I was reviewing patient charts in the residence room when the trauma alarm blared through the speakers. "Multiple casualties, highway collision, ETA 5 minutes. I grabbed my coat and rushed to the emergency bay. The cold wind met me as the sliding doors opened, carrying with it the metallic scent of snow and gasoline. Sirens wailed in the distance. Moments later, paramedics burst in with stretchers. The first patient was unresponsive. Chest trauma, internal bleeding, unstable vitals. As the team moved to transfer him, I caught a glimpse of his face beneath the oxygen mask. My heart stopped. It was Dr. Adrian Volkov. The world seemed to tilt. For a second, I could not breathe. His face, once so composed, was now pale and streaked with blood. His right arm hung limp. His chest rose shallowly, unevenly. The paramedics shouted vital signs, but their words blurred. I forced myself to move. Training took over instinct. We wheeled him into Trauma Bay 2. Dr. Frederick Mohn, the attending on call, rushed in. "Severe chest trauma," he called out. "Possible cardiac tamponade. Prepare for emergency thoracotomy." He glanced around, eyes scanning for the cardiac surgeon on duty. But the on-call specialist was stuck in another operating theater across the hospital, deep in a critical case. Dr. Moan turned to me. Dr. Soren, you have assisted Volkov countless times. You know his techniques. Can you handle the first part until we get help? The words hit me like a thunderclap. My heart pounded, not from fear, but from the weight of irony. The man who once humiliated me now lay helpless before me, and the decision to save him rested in my trembling hands. I looked at his chest, rising weaker with every passing second. His life was slipping away. There was no time for pride, no room for vengeance, only medicine. I nodded once. Prepare the surgical tray, I said quietly. The nurses moved with practiced urgency. Clara was among them. She met my gaze for a brief moment, silent assurance passing between us. As I pulled on my sterile gloves, my reflection flickered in the glass cabinet. The same lights that had once witnessed my humiliation now shone upon my redemption. I took a deep breath. Scalpel. And as the blade touched his skin, I understood that life had come full circle. The silence of the operating room was unlike any other I had known. It was not the professional quiet of focus and teamwork. It was a vacuum of disbelief, of fear, of eyes darting toward me with the same question written across every face. Can she really do this? Dr. Volkov lay motionless on the table, his once commanding presence now reduced to fragile humanity beneath sterile sheets. His chest rose in shallow, uneven breaths, the rhythm faltering as the monitors crackled with uncertainty. The accident had been brutal, a multiple vehicle collision on the icy highway outside the city. The man who once towered over others with his arrogance was now suspended between life and death, the same man who had once looked at me and declared, "You are clumsy. You will never be a true surgeon." I stood at the foot of the operating table, gloved and gowned, my heart pounding beneath my scrubs. The chief of surgery, Dr. Laurent, had not yet arrived from his conference in Zurich. The senior trauma surgeons were trapped in another emergency ward handling a mass casualty. For a moment, chaos had ruled the corridors of St. Valens, and in that chaos, all eyes turned toward me. Dr. Amelia, you have the most experience with thoracic trauma here tonight, the anesthesiologist said, his tone urgent but calm. We cannot wait. I felt the weight of the words press into my chest like stone. We cannot wait. I glanced at the CT scan pinned on the light board, shattered ribs, torn intercostal vessels, a punctured lung, a surgical labyrinth of danger. My fingers flexed involuntarily as I stared at the man who had belittled me for years. His face was pale, his jaw slack, but his expression still somehow carried a trace of that cold authority. I could almost hear his voice, low and disdainful. You are not capable of precision. You are emotional. You should have been a nurse, not a doctor. But that night there were no titles, no hierarchies, no arrogance. There was only one reality. He would die if I did not act. I took a deep breath. Prepare for emergency thoracotomy, I said firmly. My voice did not shake. The scrub nurses moved instantly, recognizing something in my tone that I had not heard in myself before. Command, confidence, clarity. As the scalpel touched his skin, I felt a strange wave of calm descend upon me. Every humiliation, every whisper, every sleepless night replaying his cruel remarks, all of it melted away beneath the sterile light. There was no fear. There was only the rhythm of the procedure, the melody of survival. Incision, retraction, suction. Blood welled up faster than I expected. The rupture in the pulmonary artery was more severe than the scan suggested. My mind raced, measuring, analyzing, predicting. My hands, however, remained steady. Clamp, I said. The nurse placed the instrument in my palm without hesitation. I moved with precision, navigating between the torn vessels. I heard my father's voice from long ago, gentle and calm, the one who had taught me to hold a knife steady, even when my heart trembled. When you cut, do not cut to harm. Cut to heal. A minute passed, then another. The monitor screamed again. His blood pressure plummeted. Amelia, we are losing him, cried one of the residents. I refused to flinch. Increase fluids, start transfusion, stay with me. I reached into the cavity, my gloves slick with blood, and found the source of the bleed. It pulsed beneath my fingertips, desperate and defiant. I applied pressure, guiding the clamp with a surgeon's intuition that no textbook could ever teach. "Prepare 4-nail-proline," I ordered. My assistant's voice trembled as he handed me the suture. He was young, terrified, but I looked him in the eye, and he steadied himself under my gaze. Together, we began to stitch the delicate vessel. Each motion was deliberate, exact, almost musical in its rhythm. The monitor's beeps began to stabilize. The pulse line softened into something more regular. I exhaled deeply, my shoulders heavy with sweat and tension. But the battle was not over. As I began to close the wound, a sudden complication emerged, an arrhythmia, sharp and violent. The heart tremored under my hand. "Defibrillator," I said quietly. The paddles were ready. "Charge to 200. The team looked at me, uncertain. They knew who he was, the man who once commanded them all, and now it was I who held his life in my hands. "Clear," I said. The first shock surged through his chest, lifting his body slightly. The monitor flatlined for a moment, an eternity of silence. Then, beep, beep, beep. A fragile heartbeat returned. The anesthesiologist looked up, astonished. "He is coming back." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. My gloved hands hovered above his chest, trembling for the first time that night. Not from fear, but from the magnitude of what had just occurred. I looked at his face again, that proud, unyielding face now softened by the mercy of chance and skill. The man who had once called me clumsy was alive because my hands, these same hands he ridiculed, had steadied his broken body and stitched him back to life. I leaned over the table, whispering so only I could hear it. "You will live, Dr. Volkov, but you will never be the same." When the surgery was complete, I removed my gloves slowly. My hands were numb, my heart still racing, but my spirit was strangely light. The nurses exchanged glances, their expressions somewhere between awe and disbelief. One of them whispered, "You saved him, doctor." I nodded, but the truth settled heavier than triumph. I had not done it for glory. I had done it because it was right, because despite everything he had taken from me, I could not let hatred decide who I was. As we wheeled him to recovery, I walked beside the gurney. The corridors of St. Valen's Hospital seemed different that night, quieter, reverent, as though the building itself had witnessed something profound. The cold, fluorescent lights shimmered off the polished floors, and in their reflection, I saw not the timid woman he had mocked, but the surgeon I had always been becoming. Hours later, as dawn crept through the glass walls of the ICU, I stood by his bedside. The monitors hummed softly. His face was pale but peaceful, his breathing steady. I felt an odd tenderness, one that surprised me. He stirred slightly, his eyes fluttering open. Confusion filled his gaze, then dawning recognition. His lips parted weakly. "You saved me?" I met his eyes, calm and steady. "Yes, doctor, I did." He looked away for a long moment, his jaw tightening with something that looked almost like shame. The silence between us spoke more than words ever could. I saw in his eyes the beginning of understanding, of humility cracking through his iron pride. For the first time in my career, I did not crave his approval. I did not need his validation. I had already found something greater, self-respect. The next morning, the chief of surgery returned and reviewed the reports. He called me into his office, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice carried quiet reverence. "Emilia, I read every line of the operative notes. What you did was extraordinary. You saved one of our most senior surgeons under impossible circumstances." I nodded, unsure what to say. He continued, "Dr. Volkov has already requested to see you. I think he wants to speak for himself." When I entered his room, the air felt heavy. He was propped up against his pillows, a pale ghost of the man he once was. But his eyes, those once judgmental eyes, held something different now. He did not look at me with superiority. He looked at me with gratitude. "I was wrong about you," he said softly. "You are not clumsy. You are extraordinary." I let his words hang in the air. They no longer had the power to wound or heal me. They were simply a truth too long delayed. I smiled faintly. Rest, doctor. You will need your strength. As I turned to leave, he called after me. Amelia. Thank you. The door closed behind me, and for the first time since my first day at St. Valens, I walked those corridors with my head high. The light through the windows painted golden streaks on the floor, and I realized something profound. Sometimes justice does not come through revenge or exposure. It comes through grace, through choosing to be better than those who doubted you. That night I had saved more than a life. I had reclaimed my own. The days that followed the surgery felt like stepping into another world, one where everything familiar had shifted, softened, and changed its color. The air of St. Valens Hospital, once heavy with silent hierarchies and unspoken judgment, now carried an unfamiliar tone of reverence. People who once walked past me without acknowledgement now paused, nodded, or smiled. The same corridors that had echoed with quiet humiliation now murmured with whispers of respect. Word of the operation spread through the wards faster than I could comprehend. Dr. Amelia saved Dr. Volkov. Those words rippled through the building, reshaping perceptions I had long assumed would never change. The interns looked at me differently now. Even the senior nurses, those who had witnessed years of my quiet endurance, carried a quiet pride in their eyes when they passed me. But amidst the recognition, I found myself retreating inward. I was grateful for the acknowledgement, yes, but what lingered most deeply was not triumph. It was reflection. Every time I walked into the surgical wing, I felt the memory of that night pulse beneath my skin. The memory of his faltering heart, the echo of the defibrillator, the moment the monitor came back to life. I had crossed a threshold that night. I had faced not only a failing body, but also the ghosts of my own doubt. And in that confrontation, I had found something unbreakable. The next week, I resumed my regular duties, though nothing about them felt regular anymore. I moved through rounds with sharper focus, a steadier sense of who I was. My colleagues began to ask my opinion more often, not out of politeness, but out of genuine respect. The chief of surgery called me into several consultations, inviting me to contribute to critical cases. It was as though the hospital had suddenly realized that I had always been there, competent, capable, unseen, and was finally willing to look. Still, I did not let the newfound attention change the way I worked. I had no desire to bask in glory. My satisfaction lay in the quiet certainty that I had done what was right, that my hands and heart had acted in harmony. Dr. Volkov's recovery was slow but steady. Every morning, I passed by his room during rounds. Sometimes he was asleep, his face pale but peaceful. Other times he was awake, sitting by the window with a distant gaze. For days, neither of us spoke beyond the necessary courtesies. I could tell he struggled to find the words that matched the weight of what had happened between us. Pride is a stubborn companion. It rarely leaves without a fight. One afternoon, as I checked his vitals, he finally said, "Amelia, may I ask you something?" I turned, keeping my tone professional. "Of course, doctor." He hesitated, then asked quietly, "Why did you do it? After everything I said to you? After how I treated you?" For a moment, I said nothing. The sunlight filtered through the blinds, drawing lines of gold across the room. His question hung in the air, fragile, honest. "I did it," I said softly, "because you were my patient. Because saving a life is what I swore to do. I could not let your past words decide who I became in that moment." He nodded slowly, his eyes moist with something that looked almost like shame. "I do not know how to live with the knowledge that I owe my life to someone I wronged." "You do not owe me," I replied. "Just live differently. That will be enough." That conversation marked a quiet turning point between us. From that day forward, he began to look at others with a little more humanity. The nurses noticed it first, how he spoke with softer words, how he listened before he commanded. His arrogance did not vanish overnight, but it cracked. And through those cracks, something like humility began to grow. Weeks turned into months. I continued my rotations, now often placed at the head of complex surgical cases. The chief began to mentor me personally, encouraging me to consider a fellowship in trauma surgery abroad. It was an offer that once would have terrified me, but now it filled me with a quiet sense of readiness. There was one evening, however, that I will never forget. It was late, well past midnight. The hospital was nearly silent, that deep, echoing silence that settles when the rush of the day finally rests. I walked to the observation deck near the surgical wing, where I often went to gather my thoughts. From there, I could see the city lights glimmering beyond the frost-covered windows. The door opened behind me, and I turned to see Dr. Volkov walking slowly toward me. He still moved with the stiffness of recovery, but his eyes were clear. "I knew I would find you here," he said softly. I smiled faintly. "You always did know how to find people when they least expected it." He chuckled under his breath. "You know, I spent most of my career believing that fear was a necessary tool, that to lead, one had to instill it. I thought respect was earned through authority, not compassion. But you proved me wrong." I studied him carefully. There was no bitterness in his tone, only sincerity. "I do not need to prove anything anymore," I said. "All I ever wanted was to be seen for who I truly am." He looked at me, his expression softening. "You are more than I ever allowed myself to see. And for what it is worth, I am sorry." For the first time, I believed he meant it. The silence that followed was not awkward. It was peaceful. A chapter, long overdue, was closing. After that night, he never treated me as a subordinate again. In meetings, he deferred to my expertise when the topic fell within my specialty. When new interns arrived, he often spoke of teamwork and respect, values I had once thought he would never acknowledge. One day, months later, I received an invitation to speak at the hospital's annual symposium, a lecture series where senior staff shared pivotal medical cases. To my surprise, Dr. Volkov was listed as the moderator for my session. When the day came, I stood at the podium in the grand auditorium of St. Valens. Rows of doctors, residents, and nurses filled the seats. The large screen behind me displayed the title of my presentation, "The Human Element of Precision: Lessons from the Operating Room." As I began to speak, I saw him sitting in the front row. He listened intently, his hands clasped, his expression solemn. I spoke of that night, not by name, not as a story of revenge or redemption, but as a testament to what medicine truly demands. I spoke of humility, of courage, of grace under pressure. I said, "Every incision we make is not just a cut through flesh, but a vow to preserve life with compassion. Skill without empathy is precision without purpose." When I finished, the room was silent for a moment, then filled with applause. Dr. Volkov rose to his feet first. He did not speak. He simply bowed his head in acknowledgement. And in that gesture, years of unspoken tension dissolved. After the symposium, I walked outside into the cool evening air. The hospital lights glowed softly behind me. I thought of all the years I had doubted myself, all the nights I had gone home feeling small and unseen. I thought of the journey from humiliation to mastery, from fear to quiet power. I realized that life had not given me justice through confrontation or public triumph. It had given me something far greater, the chance to rise without bitterness, to succeed without cruelty, to heal not just others, but also myself. As I stood beneath the streetlights, I felt the weight of my stethoscope against my chest, a symbol not of authority, but of responsibility. I understood now that being a surgeon was not about wielding power over others. It was about surrendering to the delicate balance between skill and soul. Sometimes, the people who belittle you are not villains. They are mirrors showing the parts of yourself that you must strengthen. And sometimes, forgiveness is not about absolving others. It is about freeing yourself from the shadows they cast. That night, I walked home with a sense of closure so profound, it felt almost sacred. The city hummed softly around me, and I realized that my life, in all its quiet resilience, had become its own kind of victory. Months later, when Dr. Volkov finally retired, he left a letter in my locker. It was short, written in his sharp, disciplined handwriting. To Dr. Amelia, you taught me that true mastery begins when ego ends. Thank you for reminding me what healing really means. V. I folded the letter carefully and kept it in my coat pocket. I never told anyone about it. It was not for the world to know. It was enough that I knew. From that day onward, I approached every patient, every surgery, with the same reverence I had felt that night in the operating room. Not for recognition, not for redemption, but for truth. Because in the end, the greatest transformation was not his. It was mine. I had learned that compassion could be stronger than pride, that grace could be sharper than any scalpel, and that the quietest victories often echo the longest. And whenever I passed the operating room doors, I remembered the girl who once stood trembling under harsh judgment and realized that she had never been clumsy. She had simply been becoming. True strength is not proven through pride or power, but through grace, courage, and the refusal to let cruelty define who you become.